Welcome to the Lawyering Peace interview series, where we explore the intricacies of negotiations, conflict mediation, and diplomacy in peace processes. Join us as we dive into the insights of PILPG's senior peace fellows, legal and strategic advisors, former ambassadors, to discuss their negotiation strategies, the challenges they faced, how they achieved success, and in some instances, what might have led to failures. I am your host, Dr. Paul Williams, the founder and the president of the Public International Law and Policy Group, and the Rebecca Grazier Professor of Law and International Relations at American University. In this interview, I am joined by PILPG Senior Peace Fellow Matt Simpson. I have known Matt for over 20 years. We have worked together on peace negotiations around the globe. It's great to have you here, Matt.
Thanks so much for having me, Paul. Really looking forward to this.
Great. Now, Matt has extensive experience serving as a legal advisor to parties involved in peace negotiations. Matt has also been involved in a number of post-conflict legal and policy initiatives, including designing a war crimes witness protection program in Uganda and advising on the state succession process for the Republic of South Sudan, resulting from the Comprehensive Peace Agreement with Sudan. Now, in today's conversation, we will be focusing on Matt's role as the principal legal advisor to the Darfuri delegation in the Doha round of peace negotiations, which aimed to bring about a peaceful resolution of the Darfur conflict. As our listeners will likely know, the Darfur conflict was one of the most significant and protracted genocidal conflicts in Africa. Matt led a team of over 24 international legal and policy advisors to the Darfuri delegation. Matt and his team advised on the full range of issues that presented themselves during these negotiations. Now, the Doha negotiations occurred from 2009 until 2011 and were between the Sudanese government and one of the primary Darfuri non-state armed actors, the Justice and Equality Movement, or the JEM. These negotiations were hosted by Qatar, with the United Nations playing the lead role in mediation. The negotiations culminated in a ceasefire and the signing of the Doha Document for Peace in Darfur in July of 2011. Now, while the agreement was signed by the Sudanese government and the LJM, which was one of the non-state armed actors participating in the process, a number of significant non-state armed actors did not participate in the negotiations or sign the agreement. And we'll discuss that with Matt in a few moments. The negotiations themselves covered a range of substantive topics, including vertical and horizontal power sharing, security arrangements, DDR, demilitarization, demobilization, and reintegration of the non-state armed actors, allocation of wealth from natural resources, and the return of displaced persons. Now let's dive into the discussion. Matt, you were appointed by the United Nations and the African Union as the principal legal advisor to the Darfur delegation in the Doha round of negotiations. Can you give us a sense of what it actually meant to be the principal legal advisor to the delegation? What were your overarching objectives and responsibilities? And what did your day-to-day tasks include?
Sure. Thanks, Paul. Happy to talk about that. So the role of the principal legal advisor was relatively undefined at the time. We were called up by the United Nations and the African Union. We'd been working through PILPG with a variety of Darfuri groups for several years at that point, advising them on their potential participation in the peace negotiation. So we'd been helping them gear up for what we hoped would be a productive peace process. And that was largely by engaging with the diaspora. And one of the things we'll talk about in the importance of this peace process was exactly who was involved. As you alluded to in your opening remarks, the stakeholders and the participants in the peace process, it was complicated to say the least, unproductive at times, and we really were trying to bring the right people to the table to actually participate. And so we've been advising them pro bono, the various Darfuri groups and rebel groups as they were thinking of engaging in the process. And we got a phone call from the United Nations and the African Union saying the Qataris are about to start up a process, and we'd really like you guys to come. And in fact, they're refusing to start talking to us until you show up. At the time, I was at the global law firm of Weil, Gotshal and Manges. I was based out of their DC office, but it's one of the largest and most successful firms in North America and around the world. And the support we received, and we'll talk about some of the pro bono support that I think is critical to the success of NGOs, but the support that we received from Weil Gotshal and the key players there, it's been 20 years, but Miriam Buell still holds a special place in my heart for the support that she provided me at the time as a first year, a new lawyer to Weil Gotshal, who was fully mandated and supported to engage in the Darfur peace process. It was incredible. It went all the way up to Steve Danhauser, the then chairman of the firm, and Weil and Miriam and Steve and others did incredible things for me as a lawyer and for the peace process itself by allowing me to participate and engage. Ultimately, I made the decision to go full time with the Darfur peace process and move out to Doha. And that was a little too much for a while at the time, and for me, I couldn't do two full-time jobs at once. Been decided to leave that practice and join PLPG in the peace process full time. But the support of large law firms and NGOs and in their pro bono efforts, like Weil Gotshal, had an incredible impact both on my career, but also our ability to constructively participate in the Doha peace process. Myself and you, we were the only two non-Darfuri official members of the Darfuri delegation. And so what that meant was we lived with and worked with on a daily basis the Darfuris throughout their entire engagement in the peace process. And so on a day-to-day basis, that really, it ebbed and flowed with the process itself. There were days when the process was very involved. All the stakeholders were in Doha. The Qataris were very focused. We had UN focused. The mediation team was motivated. Perhaps Chad and other neighboring governments that were participating were in town and involved. And we would go through daily negotiations, hours upon hours of negotiating various topics, switching from IDP and refugee return in the morning to wealth sharing in the afternoon, to new oil programs, et cetera. And so those days would be quite intense. We'd spend our days negotiating, working with the Darfuris on their positions, preparing them for the negotiations. And then overnight, I'd circle up with my team back in the States and elsewhere, and we'd play the time zone game. And we would have that team working through the night, preparing research materials, marking up documents, helping us form positions, so that when I would wake up, unfortunately, the Darfuris like to go to bed quite late and then wake up quite early. And so that added to the challenge. So we were getting about 4 hours of sleep a night. It was quite intense at times. But we were really pushing hard to provide the Darfuris the materials that they needed to participate, and advising them on that participation in the room and in the back rooms.
Well, Matt, let me have a follow-up question here and ask you specifically if you could talk about your role as a lawyer to non-state armed actors and how you approached that during the peace negotiations.
I think one of the important things to highlight about the role that we played and the role of lawyers in the peace process is, as lawyers, we have an ethical duty to represent our clients zealously. And everybody will remember back to first year law school that the object of the representation is determined by the client. And I think that's a really important piece that I kept with me throughout the Darfur peace talks, because unlike other NGOs that were engaging or government organizations, we didn't have an agenda. Our agenda was not for peace, certainly wasn't for war. Our agenda was to advise our clients as they participated in the peace process. And so we would do and support them in their engagement in the peace process. Now there were times, you'll recall in 2010, that was the fall of the Arab Spring, and the Darfuris, many of them were militarily quite active, and many of them were involved in the toppling of Gaddafi. And at one point, they left for several months. And we we sort of said, okay, well, we're not going to help you with that. That's your other side of your life. You fight the wars that you need to fight. That's, inherently these are non-state actors that are involved in a conflict. Many of them are generals, many of them are army officials, and they're programmed in many ways to fight the fights outside of the boardroom. We were there for their engagement in the boardroom. And so we were consistently reminding them of that and keeping ourselves honest of the role that we played, and frankly pushing back on the NGOs. I will never forget when one ambassador called me up and said, hey, look, you need to push your guys to do this. And I said, no. I said, no, that's not my job. I'm not here to tell them what to do. I'm here to advise them on their options, help them understand the menu of those options, and let them make the decision.
Matt, thanks for that great description of your role in the peace process and how you embraced your role as a lawyer and stayed true to the approach of lawyering peace, so to speak. Let me now turn to a practical question that our listeners, that inquiring minds will want to know. We mentioned that you led a team of over 24 international legal and policy advisors. Wow. How did what were the roles of some of the members within your team? How did you determine these roles? I oftentimes say a team is not a checkerboard, it's a chessboard, and every team member has different skills and capabilities, as well as challenges. So how did you sort out the roles of your different team members? Who needed to be a part of your team? And how did you design a structure for the team to work effectively together?
Sure. I mean, I love the chess analogy because I think that's right. And it was never a set team either. I mean, I think you have to be flexible and fluid with how you think about your team, especially as a lawyer advising in a very complicated process like a peace negotiation. And what I mean by that is the peace talks were not a singular issue. It was never a moment where we said, well, as long as we figure out how to solve this issue, we're great. We'll be done. It was an amalgam of a dozen plus different major issues that affected how the Darfuris and the Sudanese government interacted with each other on a daily basis and how they interacted with themselves in many ways. And so the team that we built was broken into three parts, really. First was the core team at PILPG, our NGO. I led that team. We had about a dozen folks or so back home in the States that were advising on a variety of different topics. They each brought a different level of expertise. Most of them were lawyers at the time, or training to be lawyers, and were advising on a variety of the substance behind the scenes. They were helping me review and mark up documents. They were researching critical issues and really digging in on some of the challenging points that we needed to advise the team on. I was the point person of that team living in Doha, and we can talk a little bit about that later if you want. But I was living with the Darfuris and advising them, and so everything funneled through me. But there really was an incredible team of lawyers and other advisors back home in the States that were advising through PILPG. Complementing the work and supporting the work that PILPG was doing was a relationship that we had with one of the largest law firms in the world, Baker McKenzie. And so they provided incredible support to us and the Darfuris throughout the peace process. And we worked with the senior leadership of their firm to build a team of lawyers at Baker McKenzie from across their global platform that were helping us navigate these issues. And so what I mean by that was there were times when we were working on land ownership issues, let's say, and who owns this land, who can graze on this land. And we would call up Baker McKenzie and say, we've got some real land issues here. And they would provide us with an introduction to the global head of their real estate practice, who is a real expert on how to deal with land. And we would call them up and they would provide that level of support. When we were building out judicial systems, they would provide support from their litigators and other experts, former judges from around the world. And at one point, I think we had tapped into 15 or so of their offices globally, from Sydney to Toronto to London to Egypt, around the globe, advising us in a pro bono capacity, and they would provide us with the support for our PILPG team to then go deploy. The third bucket of advisors that were on our team and were equally critical were the high-level experts that we would call in when needed. The Michael Scharfs of the world, the David Cranes of the world, others, Rick Lorenz on water issues. We would tap into PLPG's extensive network of high-level advisors who were career professionals at a variety of topics that were relevant to us and had done this before, whether it was leading a prosecution or building a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, or helping deal with water sharing and riparian rights in complicated conflict zones. We tapped into very high-level experts around the globe, really. Some of others I'm sure you'll be talking to as part of the series to provide their expertise and experience on the peace process overall.
Thank you, Matt. That really indicates the value add of having a well-structured team of talented individuals, and then also amplifying your relationships, your pro bono relationships with law firms and other experts.
And Paul, if I can add just one additional thing on that topic, it's the importance of the communication. As you're building these teams, you need to build a foundation of a core team that's going to be consistently advising and act as the point for all these other appendages. You don't need the same level of effort from all the team members at the same time. It will ebb and flow. They will come and go in terms of whose support you need and when, depending on the tenor of the negotiations and the topic. And so it was really important to have a core group at the center of your team that acted as the point of contact and the consistent communication, keeping everybody in the loop and having them all understand where we were in the process, when we might need them to the extent it was predictable. It wasn't always the case. There were certainly some emergencies where we had to pick up the phone and interrupt a vacation or other matters, but really having that communication across the globe in this case and across a variety of different experts was critically important to making sure that the team worked efficiently without redundancy. We didn't want to waste people's time with two people advising on the same issue without talking to each other, and making sure that the advice was then translated, sometimes literally, sometimes figuratively, through me to our clients, to make sure that they benefited from all that work of the team. Because what you also don't want to do is have the team working on all these issues, creating all this wonderful work product, and it never finding its way to the client.
Matt, I'm so glad you mentioned that. I would just amplify communication. Team members doing all this brilliant work, clients in the midst of intense negotiations. You need to be communicating basically 360 degrees in order to be an efficient lawyer and to help build a durable agreement. Yeah. Let's now turn, Matt, to some of the specifics of the negotiations themselves, and let's talk about points of contention among the parties. Obviously, there were any number of points of contention that arose during the negotiations, and including, of course, the tension between non-state armed actors negotiating with the regime responsible for genocide against their people. This regime may or may not have been negotiating in good faith during these Doha talks. But can you walk us through a few of the main points of contention between the parties to the negotiations?
Sure, certainly. And it certainly is a long list, as you pointed out. And as we've discussed, these are complicated issues. And so, or complicated processes with a variety of issues. I think one of the most fundamental challenges and points of contention didn't even involve the government of Sudan, the counterparty, the genocidal regime. It was who was going to be there on behalf of the Darfuris. Proper representation is such a critical issue in all of these peace processes, and understanding who should be at the table and who should not be at the table is an incredibly challenging piece. From day one, again, going back to the conversation we had earlier about the role of a lawyer, we took a neutral position on who had a right to be at the table. Many of the other NGOs, certainly the government organizations that were involved, they often had very strong opinions about who had the right and who didn't have the right. That was a lot of Western influence and European and even sometimes the Asian influence that would come in. External factors and forces would come in to try and influence who was at the table on behalf of the Darfuris. The Darfuris, of course, had their own opinion. I mean, Darfur means land of the fur. It's a tribe, the Fur tribe. Well, there's also the Zagawa, there's Dar Zagawa, there's other regions, the Mazalay. There are dozens of tribes in the Darfur region who historically are quite heterogeneous. They don't necessarily agree on everything. Some are more or less religious. Some are more or less agrarian or nomadic in their lifestyles. They have historically not always gotten along with each other. And that is to be understood. It's a very imperialist and Western approach to think that this is just a group of people that live together. They must have a common identity and a common sense of what they might want in a peace process. And so for years, that was the lead up to the peace process, was trying to better understand who are the legitimate participants in this process. And as you said, the GEM participated, the LJM participated. There were other groups that didn't or participated just a little bit, and trying to figure out who they were. There were some groups that were accused of not necessarily being legitimate representatives because a Western government had supported them in their formation. And so a real point of contention was among the rebel groups, our pro bono clients, who should be at the table. Again, we took a neutral position because we thought that was the best approach. And our role as lawyers wasn't to tell people who had a right to be here and who didn't. Another issue was outside of the rebel groups, and I'll use the umbrella term civil society. Who from the civil society had the right to attend? Were the political parties in Sudan and in the Darfur region entitled to attend? Because there wasn't necessarily perfect overlap with the rebel groups there. The universities, the students, the NGOs that were operating on the ground, the women's groups. How do you build a representative group? And that was a real struggle in Doha for the mediators and for the hosts. There were, at one point, hundreds of people that showed up in Doha. The Qataris and the UN were flying planes, UN-marked planes, picking people up, and folks were just walking onto the plane and flying to Doha for a week or two. And the Qataris were hosting them all at the Sheraton Hotel or the Movenpick or these different locations across Doha, trying to understand who should be in the room and negotiating on behalf of the Darfuris or having influence on the positions that the Darfuris were putting forward was a real challenge. So that was a real point of contention. I think another substantive point of contention or structural point of contention was who was responsible for the mediation. It was, as we mentioned, a hybrid African Union UN negotiation process. It was co-sponsored by them. And what that meant in the real world, and practically speaking, was nobody really knew what that meant. We all tried to figure out. There was a chief mediator, but the structure and the support around the mediation process was quite challenging. The African Union wanted to play a strong role, but there were tensions between the leadership of the African Union, then Thabo Mbeki from South Africa, and Jibril Basolé, the UN-appointed and African UN-appointed African Union UN-appointed mediator. And that really colored the negotiations at times. That influenced it when Mbeki would just show up. That influenced it when he would host meetings for some of the rebel groups or the government of Sudan elsewhere. And that was problematic at times. And so again, the structure is so important to get right. And if you get the process and the structure right, you can avoid a lot of the points of contention that unfortunately we struggled with in Doha. And then I think the negotiations themselves, getting into the substance a little bit more, again, because of the fact that the Darfuris weren't one group, there were issues among them in terms of Sharia law. How important is Islamic law to be codified in a Darfur government? That unfortunately never took shape, but there was a lot of negotiation over that and a lot of discussion over that. IDP and refugee return. Where do we return people to? Who the conflict, once it starts stretching out, people have known, their entire lives, and their children might be based in one area. They might not know what they would consider to be their ancestral lands. Those were real challenges. And then I think the typical wealth sharing, who gets the money, the power sharing, who gets to run the government, who gets to be influential in the government. Those were all factors that we really, really struggled with in the process, in part because we didn't have a unified voice. And I think rarely are you going to have that unified voice in a peace process. And so you just need to navigate all the different voices and do your best to bring them forward as cohesively as possible.
Matt, let's pick up on a couple of follow-up questions relating to what you just talked about in terms of the points of contention. First, let's talk about the Darfuris. How did they build internal cohesion in the face of everything you've just said? And then secondly, how did the United Nations manage structuring the mediation in such a way that it could be inclusive not only of the parties, but also inclusive of sort of the international mediators, and how do they work out some of those challenges which you've just identified?
Sure. I think, taking the second question first, the mediation team was tasked at various times throughout the process of engaging with civil society. And so there were folks from the mediation that would literally fly to Darfur on these planes and try and identify folks that were actively involved. And many of the folks on the mediation team itself, which was a diverse group, and I think that's important to understand as well. There were, Jabril Basilei was from Burkina Faso. There were others from, there was a Scottish person, there was a Swedish person. There were a variety of different folks that were involved in the mediation's part. They made efforts to try and identify the civil society leaders. They did speak with the Darfuris. They did speak with the government of Sudan at times to get their input on who the right representatives were. And obviously, a lot of the state governments that were involved, whether it was the Canadians, the Americans, the Brits, the Norwegians are very involved in the Sudanese conflict. They all had opinions and an understanding of who the rebel groups were, but then also who the other key supporters or influencers of the Darfurian message were. And so I think there was a lot of effort placed into that. At times, I think they erred on over-inclusive, and they just brought a bunch of people, many of whom didn't functionally contribute to the peace process. I think there are other ways to do it, perhaps, than just simply flying them to a venue and putting them in a hotel for 3 weeks. They tried to have these large meetings. I think in their defense, the Darfurian rebels weren't keen at times to see all of the civil society show up. They certainly saw people there that they didn't feel were legitimate representatives. Fundamentally, the peace process is aiming to resolve a conflict. And so there was a position of the rebels themselves that we are the ones engaged in the conflict. We are the ones that you need to be negotiating with. Yes, we want to be representative of our people, but fundamentally, we're here to resolve a conflict, and that should come first. That position, and going back to your first question, that position was far from unified among the Darfuris. And this goes to their identities and who they were and how they came to be. Some of the rebel groups were better armed than others. Some were better funded. They had access to more land cruisers, more weapons, especially the ones that fought against Gaddafi's troops. When they came back, they were far better armed and far better resourced to participate in the conflict. And so their approach to a peace negotiation erred on the side of less peace, a little bit more conflict. Their position was that they could achieve a great deal, and they were a credible threat to the government of Sudan on the battlefield. Others didn't have that level of military support, and it was more support from Western governments that had anointed them representatives in some ways. And so their position was to engage more. Those conversations were very difficult, especially as the lawyer and the representative of multiple groups that didn't necessarily agree with each other. We spent a lot of our time behind the scenes, not necessarily in the negotiating room with the government of Sudan, but in the back corners of hotels and in conference rooms, trying to position ourselves to advise these different groups, sometimes meeting with them one-on-one, sometimes bringing them together for joint meetings to try and talk through their various positions and help them come to a position that they could present with as unified a voice as possible. Because that's a real challenge. And I think the government of Sudan, as distasteful as their participation was at many times, it's one of the things they did very well from a negotiating and a strategic perspective was they played the various rebel groups against each other. And they used the discord among the rebel groups to make themselves look better in the eye of the Western governments and the mediation to say, look, how am I supposed to negotiate? I don't have one person to negotiate against. I agree with this group. And then all of a sudden, the next day, that group comes out and says they won't support that position. So it's not my fault that this process is taking long, the government of Sudan. It's the other side because you don't have a unified voice for me to negotiate against. Of course, I would like peace. Of course, I would like to constructively participate in a peace process, but I can't because I don't have somebody to negotiate against. That was very effectively used against the Darfuris, and it was something we really struggled with, was trying to get them on the same page.
Wow, Matt, that sounds like quite a challenge for the Darfuris to be able to maintain their cohesion within a very eclectic and dynamic delegation. Were there any techniques, Matt, that you employed as a lawyer that facilitated or helped the Darfuris to maintain or to establish that cohesion?
One of the techniques that we were successful with in the end was using the resources that our large team were able to produce of precedent from other conflict zones. Here's what worked in Kosovo. Here's what worked in this region. Here's what worked in this conflict. We spoke with UN Women. We spoke with other agencies that were tasked with coming up with best practices. And so providing that menu of options and those ideas to them and said, we're looking to build a Truth and Reconciliation Commission because you all agree that's important. Rather than each of you coming up with your own idea, here's an idea. Why don't we start from this and see what you like or don't like from this? And from that position, we would then build out, hopefully, the outline, at least, of a Truth and Reconciliation Commission that would work for everybody.
Now, Matt, I want to shift the conversation just a little bit over to practical skills. You have a wealth of experience as a legal advisor in peace negotiations, and in particular with the couple of years you spent advising the Darfuri delegation. And I'd like to talk about sort of your approach to lawyering peace, to facilitating parties to engage in successful peace negotiations. What were some of the skills that either you possessed or wished you'd possessed that were most crucial when you were advising the Darfuri pro bono clients during the Doha peace talks?
Sure. Yeah, no, there were several things I tried to lean on. One of them was building the trust of my clients. As a lawyer, you need your clients to trust you. And so bonding with your client and having them understand that you are there and in their corner. I mean, for many of them, the concept of a lawyer is truly a foreign concept. It's a Western idea that you can inherently trust somebody with confidential information to have your back and to negotiate on behalf of you and have your side in support of you when they look nothing like you, they speak nothing like you. In many ways, they don't even speak your language. Building that trust, I think, was critically important. One of the ways that we built that trust, again, going back to the role of a lawyer, was I never told them they had to do anything. We were very conscious about the words should. We would say, you might consider. We would never say, you should put this position forward. We would say, you might consider this position. We were always well-informed. We would often position ideas for them in an order that we thought made sense, but we would never tell them they had to do something. And that was critically important because there were a lot of other folks that were engaged in the process, whether they be the governments or the NGOs, that were telling them to do something a certain way. And that was not our role. As an advisor, as a legal advisor, our role was to support them in the process. And so one of the skills I leaned on greatly was building that bond and that trust. And that also came from living with them. I was in the hotel with them for a variety of hotels, for a better part of 2 years. I would spend time with their families when they came to town. I would go to the local Sudanese restaurant with them that they wanted to go to. The raw camel liver did not agree with me that one time, but it was, we were connecting, and I wanted to show them that I was a real human being, that I cared about them, and that I was there truly to support them. And I think that's an important piece of these mediations, and the role of a lawyer is to build that trust and that bond. I think another skill that we leaned on extensively was the communication, that we mentioned earlier. It's so critically important that you communicate well to your clients and to your team working back home, and that especially the point people act as a funnel for all that information. And you don't want to overwhelm your clients or those participating in the peace process with too much information at once. They have a lot going on. They're trying to negotiate a peace process and participate in it actively, hopefully. Many of them are still commanding or involved in war efforts back at home. They're also families. They're also real human beings with health issues and other things that are going on. And you need to manage the flow of information from your team to your client to not only be the information that they're looking for that's relevant to today's topic, but also condense it. A lot of the experts out there are true experts, and they go very deep into the weeds on a topic, and they really love it, and they're very passionate about it. Sometimes you need to take it up a level. Sometimes you need to distill that into more bite-sized pieces of information that your clients can digest and better understand, because they don't need the level of detail that you might have received. And so I think one of the skills that I leaned on heavily were my communication skills and translating lawyer speak into client speak, something I do in my day job now as a corporate lawyer every day. But I think that was a really important piece of this. And I think the last skill to mention is a humility and a lack of judgment, because your clients will take positions, and those participating in a peace process, it's an inherently emotional process for them. They will take positions that are emotionally grounded. It was never my position to judge them. I've been blessed never to have my family live in a war zone or be the subject of genocide. And I don't know how that would make me feel. And therefore, it was never my place to judge them for their war efforts or for the other actions that they might take outside of the negotiation room, or for even some of the positions they wanted to take. I am an outsider. I am a foreigner. I was coming to them with ideas and support, but there were times, several, many in fact, where my advice was not taken. Our advice was not taken. And that's okay. And I told them that. And at one point that really built some trust and a bond with them, because I said, guys, you don't have to take my advice. This is what I'm recommending. This is the advice we're giving you. This is what worked in this conflict zone. If you don't want to do that, that's okay. And I recall vividly a moment where one of them said, oh, okay. And you could sort of see some of the defenses coming down in terms of his relationship with me. And so there's no pride of authorship. We're not here to get our names in the newspapers or to have your name attached to a peace agreement. Your names don't go in the document itself. It is truly to advocate on behalf of people and help them make the best decision they can make. And sometimes they're going to make decisions that you don't agree with, and that's okay. Again, the client determines the object of the representation.
Well, Matt, let me ask a parallel question, because you've got some great observations. Break, 3, 2, 1, because you have a number of fantastic observations about skills that were important for you to develop and to utilize. Let's turn a little bit to the mediation. Did you observe or notice any skills that were employed by the mediators that were particularly effective? Or were there some times where you walked out of a room and thought, wow, I wish the mediation would work a little bit on this particular skill in order to be more effective?
Yeah, I think there were certainly skills shown by the mediators and their team in terms of how they were trying to build a process. I think in terms of the genuine showing the participants in the process that they were genuinely interested in a productive process. And that was everything from the one-on-one meetings that they would have and showing that connection. I think Basile and others really made their best effort to build a connection with the participants in the peace process. I do think that's really important.
Well, Matt, let me ask you a follow-on question here. Oftentimes in a negotiation, there are the formal participants. There's the parties to the peace negotiation. There are the mediators. There are the hosts, and we've talked over the last number of minutes about the complexities of parties, mediators, and a little bit about hosts. But in addition, there are oftentimes, shall we say, informal or add-on entities that engage, so to speak, in the peace process. Third-party governments, international organizations, international non-governmental organizations, and they'll be present and they'll be engaged in these processes. Can you talk to us a little bit about their role, maybe some of the challenges, as well as some of the benefits?
I think a challenge for the mediation in many ways, and it's not just the mediation, but because it was UN African Union sponsored, there were a variety of state actors and other NGOs that were trying to influence and at times flat out participate in the peace process. And they were at times quite aggressive with their positions, with their threats. We're going to cut off aid. We're going to sanction you. And they were quite judgmental. And I saw firsthand many of them come to the table or come to our clients with, this is what you have to do. I know better than you. You need to do it this way. And that really did not resonate. The ones that did more talking than listening got into a lot of trouble, or their credibility dropped. And yes, some of them represented large governments and had a lot of power to wield when it came to economic sanctions, political sanctions, support for the process itself. But there was a lot of resentment that was generated by outsiders coming in. You know, it's a delicate balance. On the one hand, you appreciate the Darfuris appreciated the outsiders coming in and supporting a process for hopefully the end of a conflict that they had been experiencing for many years. And so that was welcome. On the other hand, there was a line to be drawn between supporting and hosting a process and designing and building out a process to achieve a specific goal that might not be what the Darfuris or even the government of Sudan wanted. And so it was those outside influences and the hubris and the idea that you knew better because you represented a Western government. We saw that a fair bit. And that really pushed off a lot of my clients and at times slowed the process down because my clients would become entrenched or resentful, and that would cause trouble. I don't want to suggest, though, that all of it was bad. I mean, there were certainly Western governments and others that would come in with a heavy hand, but there were others that were very positively, actively engaged. I think specifically of the Canadians, and I say this with love as somebody from Toronto, as a Canadian, but Robin Wetlaufer and the team that she had deployed in Doha spent an incredible amount of time on the ground in Doha, sometimes in the negotiations, but also on the margins of the negotiations, meeting in the coffee shops, meeting in the back rooms, having dinner with, and engaging the Darfuris in particular on their constructive involvement in the peace process. And I was always quite impressed with her ability to convey a position and present an idea without being pushy, without being too assertive, but presenting it in a way that gave her credibility among the Darfuris and the Canadians' credibility, so that when she did come to them perhaps and say, hey, look, we need you back at the table, they understood she was coming from a place of productivity without necessarily the hidden agenda that a lot of organizations had when they engage with their Darfuris. I do think one other question and challenge with peace processes and the role of the various stakeholders is, what is the role of a host? And that was something we battled with in Darfur or in Doha. And the Qatar process was, as time passed, at the beginning, the Qataris were a true host. They facilitated, they provided facilities, they flew people in. They were incredibly generous. It was an incredibly expensive process, and they were very committed to supporting that in every possible way. And that should certainly be recognized. But as the process dragged on, and I think everybody would agree it dragged on at various points at time, but as it got longer and longer, I think you could see their patience waning, and they became more involved in the substance of the process. And there were times in conversations that we had among our delegation, what is the proper role of the process? Should the Qataris be negotiating? Should they have a position on this issue? Or is this really the role of the mediators to try and take the positions of the Sudanese government and the Darfuris and bring them together? Why are there other positions that suddenly we're considering? Or why are there other groups that are trying to influence that outcome? So the role of the host is a challenge and something that needs to be as well identified at the beginning. And I think that also goes to the role of the advisors. I recall one person on the mediation at the very beginning of the peace talks telling me, Matt, I don't think we really need you here. This is going to take, a month or two to get them on the same side on a couple of key issues. We certainly don't need any lawyers here. And we're just going to go draft this and we'll be done in 2 months. You're wasting your time. And 2.5 years later, we finally got a peace agreement, which again, not everybody signed because it was so poorly drafted in some respects. And so I think an appreciation and a recognition among the various participants for the skills that are needed, going back to those skills, lawyers are needed to draft a comprehensive document. You wouldn't think of doing a multi-billion-dollar transaction in the corporate world without lawyers. You should not think of doing a multi-billion-dollar peace agreement without them either.
Yeah, if you're going to be negotiating an end to a genocidal conflict, you want to be as serious and as comprehensive as possible when bringing in those with skill sets, such as lawyers and others.
The words have to be right. The words matter, right? And it's not just a piece of paper, and the words matter, and you have to get them right.
I'm surprised at how many times I have to remind mediators and parties that the words that they're affixing their signature to actually do matter, and that this is a social contract. Now, Matt, let's turn to just a couple more questions, one of which is successes. What did the parties and the mediators do during the Doha negotiations that contributed to some of the successes of the negotiations? How did they spot opportunities for progress in the negotiations? How did they overcome points of impasse? And then I'll ask you the corollary question of, all right, what did they fail at? What could they have done better in this process?
Yeah. Well, I think at a very high level, I think history will judge the Darfur peace process as unsuccessful. I don't think it was successful. I think we can all agree in hindsight that it was unsuccessful. It did not achieve peace in Darfur. And there's a variety of reasons for that. And we'll get to that in your follow-up question. But I think when it comes to the successes, that's not to say that there weren't successes along the way. And I think this is a key thing for mediators and those participating in peace processes to keep in mind is, and we reminded our team of this almost daily in our delegation, is how you define success. It's important to have the big definition. We would like peace in Darfur. Okay, we can agree on that. That's good. Let's all keep that in mind. That's a great goal for you to have. But if that is your only definition of success, you're going to be incredibly disappointed with a very long process without achieving any moments of success. And so in addition to that very high-level definition of success, you need to find your way to other definitions that are more achievable at various inflection points along the way. Even daily successes. Are we going to get the meeting that we want today? Are we going to get the Americans to agree to this? Are we going to get the funding to do to this? Is the civil society team going to work this way or not? What is our position going to be? Can we find some common ground on that? By defining successes incrementally along the way before you achieve that ultimate success, I think you can change your mentality and your engagement in the process and feel a lot better about the time and effort that you're spending in this. And so there were a variety of things that I think the Darfuris, that the mediation did well to achieve those smaller successes. One of them was our engagement with UN Women. And I think of the moment where I sat down for dinner at the hotel, because we were all sort of staying in the same place, with the head of UN Women at the time. And I said to her, what is the best example of a peace process or a peace agreement and how it relates to women, how it treats women? What is the best that you have? I'm sure you and your team back home in New York and elsewhere have something. And she said, well, absolutely. And so a couple of days later, her team sent me language for a variety of different topics that they deemed to be best practices, whether it was actually in practice yet or not, but their best thinking and their best ideas on the treatment of women in post-conflict zones and post-conflict areas. And I sat down with our clients, a couple of different rebel groups at that point were engaged in the process, and we went over it. And I said, well, we could include this and we could include that. And that, I think, is an example, and you'll still see one of the position papers that came out. It was a proposed draft of a peace agreement from GEM, I think it was. It has incredibly strong language on the treatment of women in post-conflict zones. And that came from a very successful interaction that we had with UN Women to lean on their expertise, to lean on their experience and say, give us the best that you've got. And then again, translating it, working it into our representation of our client and advising them as, here's some good ideas, we should consider these. And they openly considered them and welcomed them, and it made it into a proposed draft. I think that's one of the successes that I really take from that. And the fact that we were able to support a team for so long and so thoroughly cover the full spectrum of issues that came up, the stamina and not just the breadth, but the depth of expertise that we were able to bring to the process is another success that I think I feel proud of in hindsight. And I think the mediation and a lot of the others that were engaged in the process should be proud of as well.
Thank you, Matt, for that candid assessment of your successes and the successes of the mediators and of UN Women in particular. Let's turn now to some of the challenges or the failures that you witnessed and how they could be avoided in future negotiations.
Sure. So I think there's two big failures that come to mind as to the reasons why I think this process didn't work. I think the first is the lack of, and it's a bit self-serving, I'll admit that as a lawyer, but the lack of credence and credibility given to the importance of the words. The words really do matter. And the document that was ultimately produced as the 2011 peace agreement that was signed in July of 2011 was a compilation of a variety of different chapters and pages that were coming from all these different sources, and not enough time or expertise or effort was put into making it a singular cohesive document. And so there's two truth and reconciliation processes in two different chapters because nobody read it from start to finish. There are mechanisms that can't possibly be implemented because they weren't finished or thought through thoroughly. I remember talking with the senior person at the UN, and our advice was not to sign the peace agreement. And I've said that before because we thought it was just a bad document that was incapable of being implemented because it didn't hold together as a cohesive document and a cohesive program. And I remember a senior UN official giving me a hard time on that, and a US senator, in fact, at one point, giving me quite a hard time on that. And in their office here in DC at the state at the Senate building, and they said, "Why you got to get your guys to sign this? Why aren't you going to sign it?" I'm like, it's not a good document. It can't be implemented. The only thing worse for peace than not signing a peace agreement is signing a bad peace agreement, because you'll try and implement it for several years and you'll be completely unsuccessful, and you'll have just held back, and the government of Sudan will have used those 2 years to continue doing what it's doing, but now with the cover of their positive and productive engagement in a peace process. And you're going to give them credit for that, and you're going to lift some of the sanctions, and you're going to take the pressure off of them. And unfortunately, that's exactly what happened. And that UN official called me about 2 years later and said, "You were right. I'm sorry." Another one that I was very involved with on the actual drafting and gave that advice to called me about 2 weeks after it was signed and said, "Okay, I'm now on the implementation team. How am I supposed to implement this? When I read chapter 4 and chapter 6, they're completely contradictory of each other." It's like, yeah, they are. And we actually had a memo that we had produced, and I got my client's permission to share it with the UN on here's all the challenges with reading this document as a singular document. And that was a real challenge for them. And that's part of the reason why the process just didn't get implemented, or the agreement didn't get implemented, and was truly a failure of it. And I think the second failure was, unsurprisingly, the buy-in of the rebel groups. I don't think you had the support. At the end, there were 3 or so major rebel groups that were participating. One of them signed the peace agreement. The other 2 did not. The others that were legitimate rebel groups didn't come to the table. And so I think there was a real challenge with the support of the Darfuris for the peace agreement. And at the same time, I think it was built on a history of failures of the government of Sudan to uphold their obligations. And so I think it's a real challenge. I think at one point we had 17 peace agreements and ceasefires that had been signed among the rebels and the government of Sudan, none of which had been successfully implemented. And so there was also real reason to think that the government wasn't necessarily going to hold up their end of the bargain.
Matt, thank you for that very detailed explanation of successes and failures. And in particular, I like your notion that you can't always define success as establishing a durable peace. Successes build upon successes, and even bite-sized successes can be successes, so long as they're moving you down that road to a durable peace. And I think it's very illuminating the attention that you brought to these failures. These failures I've seen in peace processes as well. Words don't matter. Just get the parties to sign it. We'll sort it out during the implementation phase. What you predicted in Doha back in 2011 actually played out and led to the continuing genocide, and then one would say contributed to this most recent conflict that we're seeing now in 2023 and 2024 in Sudan. Matt, let's end with one last question. What one thing do you want future legal advisors or mediators to know about the most effective way to negotiate a durable peace?
You're going to ask a lawyer to name one thing. That's just a completely unfair question, Paul. We answer with a dozen, and there's so many different things that we've talked about that I think are critically important. But I think the one thing I have to keep going back to is that the words matter. I mean, when I look at the entire Darfur peace process and how we engaged and how little credit was given, there wasn't a single lawyer on the mediation team for the longest period of time. I think they brought one in the last couple of months. They didn't have a single lawyer. And drafting is hard and negotiating is hard. And those are skills that you learn as a lawyer. And so giving credit to the fact that the words matter and that the exercise is important. The negotiation process, the peace process is critically important. And yes, sometimes details will be sorted out in the implementation phase, but the words of the actual agreement matter. And sometimes if you're not getting the words right, it makes more sense to shorten it up. Again, change your definition of success. Maybe look for smaller successes that you can paper appropriately, that you can word with agreement, but you will never be able to implement or enforce the implementation of an agreement if it doesn't make sense on paper. Because the Western world in particular, when it looks to these processes, it looks to the words first and then to what's actually happening on the ground. And there's a disconnect there, I think, between how peace processes are negotiated and implemented and how the people that are subject and party to these agreements think about them as well. And so it's a challenge, but I think you've got to continue to focus on the fact that the words matter.
Well, Matt, it's been a real pleasure having this conversation with you. And I'm very grateful for you sharing your experience, your wisdom, your insight on how lawyers to parties, mediators can most effectively negotiate durable agreements. Matt, thank you for your time. Thank you for your energy. And thank you for all that you've done and are continuing to do around the globe to support peace negotiations.
My pleasure. Thanks so much for having me, Paul.